Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our session, 7:30 a.m. on the last day. It's nice to see you all. Hope some of you enjoyed the Josh Groban concert last night, although maybe none of you did since you're all here right now. But we'd love to do just a quick introduction and then get into our content today.
So I'm Nancy Hipschman. I am a managing principal with Sullivan Cotter, and I lead our division C3 nonprofit consulting group. So Amanda and I both have lots and lots of experience working in for-profits, nonprofits, but right now our time and careers are dedicated to serving the nonprofit sector through this division at Sullivan Cotter.
And I'm Amanda Weathington, as noted, and I'm a principal at C3 in the division of Sullivan Cotter, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. And to get us started today, the topic is pay transparency. And when we say pay transparency, I think the first thing that generally comes to mind is thinking about legislation, compliance with posting salary ranges, but what we really want to get into today is around the strategy for pay transparency. And pay transparency is rooted in pay equity and the principles around paying competitively, establishing a living wage, having opportunities for advancement, having fair criteria to make pay decisions. And it's important to think about this bigger picture. So it's not just a compliance trend, it's not just a checkbox for HR, it's really a strategic lever for achieving pay equity and ultimately organizational trust. So I hope you enjoy kind of getting a little bit deeper with us today as we get into this and really thinking that it's not just about the numbers, it's really about culture and leadership as well.
So we've kind of distilled down this like a strategy for doing effective pay transparency. So we know that you could also call pay transparency, okay, we have to post our job ranges and we do that and we leave it there. But we're really here to talk about effective pay transparency that results in a trust or a more high trust environment. And we've kind of distilled it down into kind of three main points. And one is doing the hard things, being unapologetic, and then pacing yourself. And by doing the hard things, we're really talking about commitment and clarity and addressing ambiguity in your practices, your legacy practices, maybe even dealing with leadership resistance. And in terms of being unapologetic, once you do the hard things, what we mean there is really thinking about the fact that pay transparency loses its power when we're tentative about it. So it's about establishing all the groundwork, getting your house in order, and putting a stake in the ground and sticking to it. Effective pay transparency isn't perfection, but it is more about ownership. And then when we think about the third pillar here, pacing yourself, it's not what you think. We're not saying pace yourself and keep it nice and steady and slow. It's actually about the pace at which the workforce and the environment is changing. And actually, we're going to be encouraging you to go more quickly if you're not already there. So we're going to cover all three of these things. But the first of the topic is do the hard things. And it's not, as our icon would suggest, this isn't about hiking. This is about actually getting your house in order. We know you can do the hard things, but we also know that probably in this audience, you're in one of three categories. You're in an organization that's already fairly transparent. Maybe you're sharing even salary ranges and having good conversations about pay, or you're kind of maybe just checking the compliance box and you're posting what you're required to, and maybe you're in an organization where you're not doing anything transparently at all. But we're going to start by kind of saying here that we know that most people wouldn't argue with the idea of pay transparency. It's not a bad idea, but it's hard to do if you don't have your house in order. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's what we mean by doing the hard things. So this is all about organizational readiness. And I think the most important thing is we were looking at some of the SHRM research, actually. And we saw that 43% of organizations out there are not sharing their salary ranges right now. And it'd be interesting to see just a quick show of hands here. So how many in this room are currently working for an organization where you know your full salary range? Okay, so probably not even 43%. Okay, interesting. All right, so if we can see those hands again, And then lower your hand if you are in a state where it's required that you do that. So even fewer, right? So I think the message here is that those that are sharing are doing so potentially because they have to do that, and very few organizations have really kind of fully adopted the more transparent approach. We want to get into the difference here between simply just doing what you have to do, so posting a hiring range in states that are required, to moving along to sharing the range, to then maybe even having good, effective development conversations instead of talking about compensation. So our concepts here are really about effective pay transparency is not just sharing data, being transparent with information. It's about setting context for that. It's about also adding to the conversation the how and the why. The how being your benchmarking methodology. How did you get those ranges? What's the compensation philosophy on which that's based? And then there's the why, which is why am I where I am in the range, and being able to answer that question. And then there's really kind of other things you have to be thinking about when you're transparent with information that's historically been a little scary to talk about, and that's really making sure you're culturally ready. So it's that shift in mindset around talking about pay, and that's an okay thing to be talking about. And again, if you think about today's workforce as a combination of multiple generations who probably have varying levels of comfort with the conversation around pay, there's probably the we don't talk about it type of person. There's the I don't really talk about it, but I'd like to. And then there's the we talk about everything population. And all those people are working together in the same organization. So the cultural aspect of this is really important. And then finally, there's the legal and the ethical, the obvious implications of pay transparency, and how that just going full force without organizational readiness can create an environment where you're surfacing inequities, or even the perception of inequities, which is just as important. And so that's about doing things like pressure testing your benchmarking methodology. It's about looking at pay equity studies, and we even take it a step further in our organization where we're just not doing the math around pay equity and are people paid fairly, but we're taking it to another level and doing pay representation studies. That's about where do all groups of people have access to the higher paying jobs. That's also a really key part about equitable pay and about being transparent. There's also constructs in your organization where you can create your own teams, like leadership councils or things like that. Does everybody have access to those? Those are people in jobs that tend to have higher influence, which is also a little bit about pay and influence and power. So all that speaks to the import of being ready on these three scales. So
before you go on, I thought I'd share just two stories, especially around the cultural shift and the compliance. A few years ago, we worked with a client that was preparing for pay transparency, and they really had to shift around how they engaged leadership and stakeholders. This wasn't just an HR initiative, so I think that's also part of the cultural shift is having those conversations, bringing groups of leaders and stakeholders along. But then it was also about knowing how many different ways of communicating this, how frequently it would get communicated. And it became a cultural shift that this became part of an ongoing topic. And that they also then had series of town halls. They had manager education sessions. It was led in part, sometimes we supported them doing that. Sometimes they were leading that on their own. They had availability for open office sessions to come in and ask questions. And the real cultural shift was it went from just telling and saying things to really having a dialogue to ask questions. They had an ongoing FAQ that got posted. And so as different employees had questions to help clarify things about structure, progression, all of the information to help them understand how pay decisions were made. It was kind of a living document. So all of these kind of changes in how they communicated, made accessible information about pay, and then also had leaders and managers on the forefront talking about it, not just talking to HR about it also. I think on the legal and ethical compliance or implications piece, another example was an organization that went in kind of with the lens of we need to fix something. And they communicated it as we're fixing inequities. And they didn't do really the work around the hard stuff of talking about where they were going, what they were trying to achieve, what their philosophy was about. And it actually kind of backfired because they went in and just talked about we're making some corrections, which you need to do, right? I'm not discouraging that, but this is really around if you're going to approach it and you need to address something, I think it's more than just correcting. It's also continuing to educate and put processes in place that are going to ensure understanding of this too.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, so basically in summary, you have to have a transparent process in order to have transparent outcomes, and I think that's kind of one of our big messages. The SHRM research also showed that if you think about the statistic I just noted, right, so 57%, we talked about 43% don't share, but 57% do share what the ranges are in their organizations. This was a recent survey, pulse survey that SHRM did. But they also asked, well, like, how many of you think that your organization is transparent around pay? And that number dropped to 33%. So if you think about even amongst organizations that are sharing some form of information about pay ranges, it drops in terms of only a third of you thought that, like, your organizations were transparent. That's not that many. So there's work to do. And I think that for you to have successful pay transparency, and by the way, we just have to say that, like, this is coming for all of us. So if you are not in a state that requires it, you might end up being in a municipality that requires it, or a county, or however all that works. But you have to really think about, even in the age of remote work and hybrid, I mean, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, but if you employ people in more than one area, like, you know, this is all showing up everywhere with the internet and hybrid and remote and all that. So it's actually really important to get this right and be ready to not just sort of check the box on we're just going to share the info and then we're going to be done with our transparency efforts. So our point here is how do you know if you're doing pay transparency the best that you can do? And we've kind of said, if you can answer these 5 questions as an organization, or if your manager can, or your leadership can, you're doing pretty well. And so we've distilled it down to these 5 questions. So can you answer the question of why is an employee paid where they are in the range? What criteria were used to make that decision? What would make somebody be paid lower or higher in the range? Is everyone's pay using that same criteria? And the key one, right? When are exceptions made? Because we all know about those exceptions that we make when it comes to pay. So quick show of hands. I'm sure there may not be that many, but how many work in an organization where you think that your leader or maybe your people managers can confidently answer these questions? Okay, so like less than 10. So that's kind of telling. So, but the good news is there's a little bit of a roadmap. That's kind of where you have to get to once you sort of either have to be transparent or your desire to be transparent, you're moving in that direction. So if we kind of go on to this next slide and we think about where you start, we all know compensation philosophies. Most of you have them. It's when we ask organizations if they have them, it's questionable. Sometimes organizations don't, but then we'd say, do you publish those or talk about them? The prevalence gets a little bit lower. But this is your anchor. This is where you set intention, and it should be a living tool, and it should be specific enough that it answers some questions for you. So we all know that a typical compensation philosophy answers 3 questions. It answers, how competitive do we want to be? Against which kinds of organizations do we want to be competitive? And then how do we want to deliver that competitiveness? And that's a standard traditional comp philosophy. But in today's world with pay transparency, we have to be answering a 4th question with comp philosophy, which is, what do we pay for? And then what criteria do we use to pay people with? And so that's going to be a really essential element of evolving your compensation philosophies. As we know, they're the foundation for this. It connects your pay to your values. It is a framework for your decisions. It's a tool for managers. It provides clarity. But most importantly, it's where you start building trust around your process with pay. And so that philosophy has to be there too. You've got to be transparent with that philosophy. So given that these are all foundational to then what happens next, it's your benchmarking methodology, It's where your ranges get set based on your philosophy. And ultimately, you move into that stage where you're defining where does somebody get placed in that salary range? What's that criteria? And you need your philosophy to be in place to do that. So if we kind of talk about this next point here, placement in range guidelines, and we've kind of come up with those. We've kind of thought about it in two ways: placement in range guidelines for both candidates and existing employees. And basically at hire, you want to sort of think about being able to communicate your comp philosophy, what as an organization you pay for, and you can even talk about what you don't pay for. You also want to be able to establish some of that measurable criteria for where to place a new hire in a range. And then thirdly, you're going to have to be testing for internal equity. I don't know, you want to touch on some of those criteria?
Yeah, I think that we'll talk about at time of hire, and then we'll also talk about within your current employee base. If you're going to kind of think through pay transparency and you're going to have more information out there around what either your pay ranges are or what your pay rates are, however you're establishing your compensation system, one of the things you're going to have to contend with is, how do I bring somebody in to this existing ecosystem, right? And what do I value if I have to make a decision, because there's a range that I can use to make that decision around new compensation. And these are some things you can think about, right? You don't have to have all of them, but I don't think you should mix and match based on the candidate either, right? So I think it's going to have to be really clear. Yes, we value prior experience, and this is how we think about prior experience. And is it recent or 10 years ago? We've had an example where somebody was like, 15 years ago I was doing that, and now I've transitioned into this other type of role, and now I'm looking for a move back into this space. And is that something that you're going to give? Is that recent enough to say, yes, you've had relevant experience at this level, right? So really putting definition behind this is also helpful. I think if you want to consider whether somebody has had that functional experience, like I've had a depth of HR knowledge, but maybe not at a director level, for example. Do you value that? Or do you say they've been an HR director in another organization of comparable size, maybe we should pay them further into the range, right? But you have to have those kinds of scenarios to think through. And I think you have to be unwavering in that as well, right? So that if you're saying this is what you're going to pay for at time of hire, when your hiring manager comes and says, yeah, but they're really great and we really want to get this candidate and they have X, Y, and Z, you have to be clear that this is kind of the principles you're sticking to also. I'm going to just add one more point there too. Some of the principles could also be you don't hire in above the median or the midpoint of your range, for example. And so those are other types of criteria at time of hire that seem easy on paper, and then when the numbers come together, that's where it gets really tricky. And so I think really being clear about what are your guidelines, like having them, they don't have to be part of your philosophy per se, but you should be able to reference them in some way.
And I'll just add a quick point. It just makes me think, even if we didn't have this pay transparency as a concept surfacing, we should still be able to answer all these questions. These should still be part of the fabric of how people's pay gets determined. So if you're thinking about bringing any of this back to your organizations and you're not doing pay transparency, this still matters.
Yes. What about internally? And so some of this is part of getting your house in order, right? People are going to be paid where they're paid today, right? You're not starting fresh and building an organization and having this kind of perfect construct. You're working within an existing framework. So when you think about what criteria you may use moving forward, if you're not using these already, the two most common are time and role and performance. Time and role tends to be the most objective type of measure to use. You can say people who have been in the job longer have gained more institutional knowledge in that level of role, would be paid further into a pay range or more competitively to an anchored pay rate. Or we'll talk about other constructs too outside of just a traditional pay range, but if most organizations are using some type of pay range, then you'd want to think, why are people differentiated within that range of pay? Time and role tends to be a criteria you can check as well. So you, as part of your annual processes or however frequently you're looking at this, you can say, if we said people with 5 years in their position should start getting paid closer to the midpoint, you can test for that. And if you've got people at 5 years sitting at the minimum of the pay range or in that first third, that might be an area that you want to address, right? Or think about the budget for that, or how do you start moving people through the range? It's really difficult to do that in standard pay increase budgets as well, right? So I think there's a budgeting aspect to all of this. If everybody's getting 3 or 4% pay increases and the ranges are moving 2% every year, you're not really gaining ground to think about the range horizontally. I think we're so kind of accustomed to this vertical ladder. The time and role helps you think about this a bit more horizontally also, and how to have somebody in a role have some pay progression. And that's part of the transparency aspect also. It's not just why am I here, but what's the potential earnings in this role also, and how could I achieve upper quartile pay? Can you answer that question? Or is it reserved or not used, right? So I think you have to kind of check that within your organization. The performance side gets a little bit trickier, but it can still be used. And I think at a minimum, everything we're saying assumes good performance standing, right? It assumes kind of minimal level of performance to kind of think through any pay progression or pay transparency, pay movement options. But when you're thinking about performance, what we put here on the slide are just some ideas of how to help calibrate this, how to help make this a process that you could also communicate clearly around, that it seems less black box of what is good performance, how did we assess somebody's performance and change their pay as a result of it. So I think that oftentimes organizations like to use both, they'd say it's time and role, and then we think about performance criteria. But you really should spend some time in your organizational readiness around where does performance show up and where do we want to give it credit in this process. And you don't always have to give it credit in base salary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too.
Well, and also you might be one of those organizations that say, we pay for performance, and then everybody gets a 3 and a 4. So there could be that too. So it's pressure testing your actual practices, because then you're not paying for performance. But you could at least say you need a 3 or 4 to move through the range, or to be at 5 years in the job at the midpoint, you need to be getting a 3 and a 4. So there's ways you can use it. But I think we all overemphasize how performance shows up in our pay programs, except if you've got a really formulaic, outcome-driven incentive program, then I think you're probably closer.
Yeah. I have one more example. I'm just going to touch this really quickly. This is slightly engineered. This gets a little more complicated. What we're trying to stress today is a simple approach to get started with a pay transparency strategy.
Yeah.
But some organizations like rubrics and formulaic approaches, and if you're one of those, we have found this can be successful too, right? If you identified criteria, I would caution the more criteria you have, the more complicated it gets and the less discernment you're going to have around this. So maybe pick 2 or 3 of these, don't do all of them. But you could set a set of criteria, assign a scoring range to that, assess that, and have some total points that then indicate where along your continuum somebody would be paid based on this criteria too. I think all of that to say what you're going to know your organization's culture, what works for you, what you have today, and what you're trying to move towards. So it doesn't have to be perfect. Some of these practices we've seen implemented and evolve over time. I think the story I told earlier about kind of the cultural shift organization that really started thinking about how they communicate differently, they knew when they started they weren't where they wanted to be, but they were still very communicative about all of that. They really were changing it. They knew, they said, we're starting here, we want to be more competitive in these areas, but at a minimum, we're going to share where we're at today. And they shared that they're going to go on this journey and continue to put emphasis on it. It wasn't a one-time approach. So I think wherever you are, whatever you do, you just need to be all in.
Okay, well, we're on to our second pillar here. So we've done the hard things. Okay, we're ready. And so now what? So we just said, listen, at some point you have to just go for it and the sorry, not sorry concept here, right? Again, doing pay transparency well doesn't mean that you're doing it perfectly. You're evolving. Like, don't expect to do this perfectly and then just out of the gate, nailing it. Because it's not a perfect process, and it's administered by imperfect bodies, the humans. So what we do want to talk about is it's that ownership. So not perfection, but ownership. And so why be unapologetic? So there's a substantial body of research out there around this. We picked a couple to talk about today, but there's one that's called procedural justice theory. So people are more likely to accept outcomes that they disagree with if they perceive the process as fair, if they understand it, and they understand the rationale behind the decisions that are made. So it's like fair process matters more than outcomes. So this is why it's okay to sort of say, this is how our organization does it. And I don't mean that you're going to be like it or not, and thank you very much, and slam your door. But this is really about thinking about that we're all humans, we're working with humans, and some of this other research that I think is really interesting is this cognitive neuroscientific research that says that we are human beings and we are wired to reduce uncertainty in our existence. So if you think about that, we hate blank spaces. We perceive a lack of understanding and a lack of clarity as a threat, like in our core DNA, right? That's how we made it all these years. So when an employer can share the how and the why to how decisions are made, that helps an individual really reframe the narrative. I mean, and if you think about this, if you're not filling in that blank space in terms of why am I paid here in this range, the employee is going to do it. And they're going to do it with, this is what we all do, right? We pick our most insecure thought and we're like, it's because I'm not valued, or no one cares, or it's unfair, and then we're all gonna go there, we just do it. But as an employer, you have an opportunity to kind of control that narrative and redirect it if you have a sound methodology and approach to how pay decisions are made. And it actually just makes talking about pay, which is traditionally, kind of an conversation, to one that can become quite normalized if we all understand how it's done. And again, this is about clarity and fair process and not about gaining agreement and alignment with everybody. So I think the point is, you don't want to leave things open to interpretation. And that's kind of what we're all doing right now by not being as transparent as we could. So we just talked about why be unapologetic, but let's talk a little bit about how to be unapologetic. And I don't know how everybody feels about this, but it's like the exceptions. As consultants, we see an awful lot of how people actually make the sausage, and there's a lot of exception making in the sausage. So this is a really clear area where we can all make some improvements in our pay administration. Again, the objective is to equip leaders and managers with a platform for confidence around pay decisions. And it's really hard to do that when there's a moving target, when we don't have criteria, when we don't have something to work with. Interestingly, SHRM also did some studies that said that 38% of organizations that identified pay transparency failures cited undocumented exceptions as the reason for those failures. So I thought that was very interesting because this speaks to this very thing. We've got to stop, that's why it's stop apologizing. This is how we do it, or this is how they told me I have to do it, if you're a people manager. And really just grounding yourself, and this is how we do it. This is a thoughtful approach, etc. So being unapologetic means making few exceptions, limiting them, documenting them, calibrating them across the organization, being disciplined.
I think it's really owning what you say you want to do, right? And to have a process that you're really clear in communicating, and then you break once in a while, erodes that trust also. So no exceptions.
Few.
Okay, few.
You can say few.
Don't tell us though. No. Go ahead.
All right. So here's what's really interesting, not knowing exactly kind of what part of the HR world you're all from, but you've either said this or you've heard it or you've advised it, but it's like, we don't pay for the person, we pay for the job, right? Or when you're benchmarking, you're like, we benchmark the job, not the person. But the truth is, our systems today are not set up to support being transparent about pay. And that's why more organizations aren't doing this. If you think about how our systems are set up, a most traditional pay system has a 50% range spread from the midpoint, right? It's plus or minus 20%. That's actually pretty wide. And if you're doing pay bands, even wider. I don't know many that are doing that anymore, but still a 50% range spread is pretty wide. That gives you what we would probably call hyper flexibility. And if you're operating in an environment where you don't have guidelines, or you have like loose guidelines, that you can basically pay in certain parts of the range for various reasons, but ultimately the hiring manager or the manager is going to make that decision. That's a lot of discretion. That can be a lot of bias that creeps in, and it's kind of where we are today, with the fact that now legislation is coming into play to help us kind of write the story here, and get things a little bit cleaned up around pay inequity. So I think all this is really important. So as much as we like to say we don't pay for the person, we pay for the job, we've really been paying for the person, which is why we have pay inequity. So we're kind of suggesting moving from that traditional approach of being a little bit more person forward to moving towards a more job forward approach. And I'll give you an example. It's going to be on the far end of the example of examples, but it's actually a really interesting one. We have a client that has, for every job, 3 rates of pay. And you attain one of those 3 levels of pay through competency development. So they spent their time, they don't spend a lot of time figuring out the market rates. It's pretty simple. And it's basically thinking of, and they're competitive rates of pay also. But they basically require people to really work on development and evolving their tools and their capabilities and their contributions. And then they move into one of those 3 rates of pay. And they will tell you that over the 10 years that they've been doing this, they've only really lost out on a candidate 1 or 2 times. And they've, in retrospect, said we probably were candidates that we were okay losing because they weren't really bought into our culture. And everybody there is really happy, high engagement scores. Everybody knows what these pay rates are. It's not a secret, and you're at 1 of 3 of them. But they're competitively set. I mean, if you set them at the low end of the pay scale, nobody would be okay with that. But they're fairly competitive. And they don't really spend a lot of time talking about compensation. The door at HR is quite short. And it's really, people are there to start talking about, they're moving the conversation from, what am I worth and am I paid fairly, to how can I develop? How can I add value? How can I do more to contribute? So I think that's what we mean by moving to a job forward approach. So yeah, we're giving up a little bit of flexibility, or hyper flexibility, I might characterize it as. But you're starting to kind of say, we don't need to have this whole range, and we don't need to have all this flexibility, because there's pros and cons with that too. And so if starting to rethink how we think about negotiation with pay, we've all been sort of indoctrinated into this concept of that we need negotiation. But even as we know, there's some car manufacturers out there, I won't name any, but that don't negotiate, right? The car price is the car price. A t-shirt price is a t-shirt price. You don't negotiate those things and you buy them. Well, that concept could easily translate into people giving some flexibility and choice, but we really don't need to have the maximum flexibility that we have today, because it hasn't really served us all that well.
You might ask, well, in this job forward approach, where does performance fit? Or how do we think about rewarding the individual then if we're paying for the job? Or is there some loss of motivation, right, in this type of program? And I think those are all good questions to ask and figure out if it would work for your organization. I think this is just the way that we're describing this is kind of the most transparent, equitable type of program. And really, to break it down, we're saying the job rate is $80,000 for this job, right? There's not individuals in the organization that make $81,000 or $82,000. Everybody at that level makes $80,000, right? And then the second tier might be set at $85,000, right? So if you've demonstrated those competencies and you're paid at a tier 2, then everybody at that tier 2 is paid $85,000. And maybe for job B, the pay starts at $90,000, right? But everybody in job B makes $90,000, right? That's kind of the construct that we're talking about. Where does performance show up? Well, one, it shows up in those development conversations and thinking about more of a competency-based model as well. But you can still have other types of recognition and reward programs. You could still have a bonus program in that structure. You could have a recognition or a spot award program. You could still do sign-ons or things like that, right? You could still have some flexibility there to think about the individual situation, but your core program then shifts kind of your focus. So we just offer this as one example. We wanted to give you some practical tips, whether that's where you are on your journey or not, to just share how others have done that too.
And this really speaks to like, okay, what are we even trying to do with all this? What's the intended consequence of doing pay transparency? And we've talked about, like Amanda talked about in the very beginning, it's like a core principle of pay equity, right? We want to make sure that how we pay people is fair. And both in a real and perceived way. Those are equally important, reality and perception of reality. We want to limit bias. We want to mitigate any unexplained differences. We also are looking at trying to have more of a high trust environment. And why is that important? High trust equals high engagement equals high productivity. High productivity equals high profitability. So it's like kind of a win-win for everybody. So I think thinking about transparency and around pay is not really like a compliance, we've got to do this thing, but it actually could be a very valuable tool to advance the conversations around pay and then start to move away from the conversation around pay. I mean, it really shouldn't be a distraction for people. It should be a tool. And then you want to start to move into the better part of this, which is how can an individual work on developing themselves and advancing their skills so they add more value and then can move up and be compensated more. I mean, that's really what the conversation should be about. And that's so much easier for a people manager to have that conversation. It's easier for an employee to have that conversation. And then we can all still get to the same place. But we also want to be realistic. We're not going to sugarcoat this. Pay transparency isn't without its unintended consequences. And no matter how well you do pay transparency, there's still going to be some things that are going to be hard, which is why we started this whole thing with do the hard things. One of those is you're going to have to deal with some of the research that's out there. And you know, as they say, you can find anything that you're out there looking for. Well, if you want to look for evidence to say not to do pay transparency, what you can find is a study that says that organizations that do pay transparency pay less than those that don't. But if you think about why that is, that's because those that are more transparent about pay have eliminated those high layers. Right? So you don't have those people in the organization anymore that are bringing those averages up. So it's not really like they're paying less, but it's more that their average pay is more consistent and you're now managing to more of a central tendency. So you could also flip that script and say there's a lot more fairness happening in that organization. But there are studies out there that will suggest these things, and if you don't peel back the onion, they could be a little bit misleading. There's other things like you're going to have to still mitigate the people out there that who are going to do the comparisons of themselves to others and just never be satisfied. That's life. So life still creeps in here too. You also are going to have to deal with the traditional way of managing pay, which is to have that hyper flexibility and bring it in a little bit. And I actually think that's a good thing. We often think about having less flexibility and more rigidity or more structure as a bad thing, but actually, if you're a people manager, having more structure is a really good thing. And the reality is that human nature, we like a little bit more structure. I mean, let's just be real, we do. So it's kind of embracing that in the right way. And then finally, you're going to have to deal on occasion with somebody that is disappointed, or maybe you lose a candidate because you've got a little bit more structure and you're really trying to push more for the equity than you are for the flexibility. So that's going to happen too, and that's also going to be just part of this. So these are all things that no matter how well you do transparency could still happen, and there's just things that you accept like everything else. So we've talked about all this stuff about how to do the hard things, be unapologetic, but okay, so you've done all these things, you're feeling really good, you've got your stake in the ground, well, so now you got to get going.
So you got to pace yourself. We think about this as like you don't want to wait to get started with pay transparency. So even we did show of hands in the room earlier of who's posting their ranges and then who's posting ranges when you're not required. But you might also be on the journey in some other way, right? Maybe you're not quite posting the ranges, but you're doing some of the hard work behind the scenes. Or maybe after today, you start reflecting on, if we have to change some constructs, how do we get started on that, right? Or if we want to just test some of these principles, can we test them and like start to figure that out? So then we know where we are on our readiness scale. But we really want to just convey that you have to find your pace group. It's like training for a marathon, right? You can't just get there and then get to the start line and run a marathon. At least I cannot. So I think what we really want to consider then is what's your start line and what's your finish line. And if your finish line is going to move, or maybe you're going to do another marathon next year, how are you going to plan for that also? So really we want to say get started and set this foundation for some of the deeper strategies. So we're saying you're not just here lounging and waiting for it to happen to you. You're going to go and get started. And I think that, I know many of you in the room are in these kind of different spots here, but starting to have some more frequent conversations, even amongst your peers, your leadership teams, is one way that you could start. You want to be nimble, right? We've said many times today, it's not about being perfect. So part of this pace yourself is just thinking about what do you need to do to get started or continue or evolve, or maybe take one of these concepts you've heard today and start testing it to see if you can do it. But the other piece that we want to talk about too is that jobs are changing and the pace of work is changing. We've really thought about pay as an annual cycle. We've thought about it as like there's a job description for a job, and that's kind of the core duties that the job does for the whole year. And I really would like us to start thinking about too is, does an annual cycle continue to work, especially in the era of pay transparency? Like, can you change pay once a year? Can you think of jobs as kind of this fixed event? Like, where do the other pieces show up in the way that jobs are being more collaborative? I think in general, the pace, like the introduction of AI and other technologies, are just changing how fast and efficient we can get work done too. So we're thinking about maybe some ways, again, other constructs you can say of how to stay ahead of static pay systems. Most of these systems have been built with pay ranges in mind, and we've kind of gone through some of the scenarios of how you might methodically move through a pay range. But what we want to talk about too is that this data is everywhere, right? It's at everyone's fingertips, whether your organization is sharing it, or they can go on Glassdoor, salary.com, go look at your competitors or peer organizations that are posting job ranges as well. So the data is available. And we've just put some ideas here of thinking about kind of these traditional structures, like a title-based structure. You move from a manager to a senior manager. When you're thinking about pay transparency, that indicates a pay change typically, right? Or a promotional rate of change. Could you also think about impact or scope-based pay? Like, as you're thinking about your criteria for why somebody might be paid where they are, or how do you reward for impact or project completion or things that come up that are maybe outside of typical responsibilities? It kind of goes into that role level framework too. Do you say, like, this is what a manager does in our organization, and this is how we think about manager level pay? But are you really then getting into the competencies or contribution framework mindset as well? Like, that all comes up. These are the harder things around pay transparency, of not just what is my job, but how am I going to get rewarded in these other scenarios too. I think the third one is kind of what we're all talking about here, is like your static decision making, right? And starting to think more collaboratively, bringing stakeholders along, not just an HR challenge, right? And then the last one is kind of thinking about where we've come from and where we're going, with kind of pay decisions made more closed door, starting to be more open about that. But really having managers have the competence, the sophistication, the tools to be able to have some of these conversations too, that have normally been reserved kind of for that HR expertise. So what else do we want to talk about? We wanted to say, what does this look like in practice, right? So as you're thinking about this, I've talked a bit about this impact or contribution. But I think you have to ask, like, is that something that we want to consider in our pay framework, right? What's the impact of these roles? Are we measuring for contribution? Are we even considering that in terms of individual pay practices as well? The communication piece you're going to see come up here as well, like agile communication. I think we've given a lot of examples here, but I think that is what this looks like in practice when it comes to it, right? It can't just be one person sharing this information. And I think you have to have different ways to give feedback, to receive information, to answer some of those hard questions. And so when this really gets into practice, you're really looking forward also, right? You don't always have to look back and say, we didn't do this before. What you really want to start thinking about is how adaptable are we? And is this system and framework going to set us up for kind of keeping up with that pace? What's coming in the future? Okay. I think that's good on this one. And then, okay, what happens when pay transparency is undermined, right? Or things that may undermine pay transparency. So we've noted wide salary ranges, right? I think in some of our data and research, we're also seeing that this plus or minus 20% kind of tradition of building a pay structure. If you've built pay structure, it's like you pick your midpoint and you say the minimum is 20% less and the maximum is 20% more. And that's our pay range for this job. That's actually too wide. The data is suggesting pay is also narrowing, right, in terms of how wide kind of your 25th percentile up to your 75th percentile is in the marketplace. This is getting a little bit more comp analyst thinking there, but from a strategic level, you want to say, what's our risk of underpayment or overpayment in this job? And wider salary ranges kind of promote that risk a bit more. So we're encouraging thinking about narrowing your pay ranges or thinking about that job-based approach to pay as well. It limits some flexibility, but what it really gives is some clarity. And you can still be competitive and think about your budgeting process within that.
And here we're not talking about going to like a step-based system like you see in government, right? But we are talking about ask yourself the question, what if we had like 6 levels of pay for every job? Like the client we talked about had 3, but like what if you had 6? And you really clearly define like how you got to each of those 6 levels. I mean, wouldn't that be so much easier to talk about, to implement? And why can't we do that? Like we've just there's just other ways to do this to make it less difficult. So this is one of the things where if you think about if you're gonna like go for it with pay transparency, but you've got the wide ranges, well, know that that's gonna work against you. So there's got to be things that you want to start to think about to make it easier for yourselves.
Yeah, like your first step could be maybe we just pull the minimums of our job ranges up, right? If we're trying to think about that, or just to make a tweak to it that way. The second one is discretionary pay. I think this goes without saying that that's where bias shows up and presents itself in these types of pay decisions. And it could undermine your ability then to be clear and transparent around where you are going or where you want to be. It's okay to still have some discretion in your pay programs. We're not suggesting eliminate discretion, but the more you can put some measurable impact behind it or have calibration sessions, right, or have the ability to kind of push back, avoid that group think around pay decisions can also be really helpful. And we've said it, and you've heard our points of view on negotiations, but I think you really have to think about that. And try to challenge yourself to say, what happens if we don't negotiate on this and we have our core principles in place, we're unapologetic about it. Some of this is you do have to be willing to potentially have somebody walk away, right? Or for somebody to have some hard feelings about the decision. But if you're really going back to saying, this is what we value, and we're unwavering in that for equity or for compression or for competitiveness, or because this aligns with our mission, I really think that those conversations can be more powerful than negative also. And so just consider how negotiations show up and who it's impacting most when somebody benefits from a negotiation also. Okay. Last slide, and then we'll take some questions. But wanted to just share some success factors. We just talked about things that could undermine. We've talked about all of these throughout our session today, but I think these are some really important pieces. If you kind of had to take away anything from this presentation, we'd summarize it kind of in these six bullets here too. You want to be able to have some clarity around your policies and your guidelines. And that means more than just having it in people's heads, right, or minds. Like having some way to document this is important. I think you really want to be thoughtful around that communication piece. Who's engaging? Who's getting training? Where do you have to upskill on the communication component? When do you think about leadership development as part of this pay transparency model, right? So I think that has a lot of other tentacles other than figuring out just the how much piece of it also. We said consistency, right? So the more you're consistent in this approach, the more successful it tends to be. Exceptions, you heard that loud and clear today. And then I think just offer regular engagement, kind of shift how you're offering pay discussions once a year, and weave that more into your framework or your fabric of where you're providing information. Any last thoughts?
Nope.
All right, we said questions, but we really are here to say let's have a conversation. So if there's something you want to share or ask to elaborate a little bit more, I think those are okay too. They don't always just have to be questions.
Yeah. We're being waved at. They're back in the, hello.
Hi, in the back of the room.
Hi. How do you handle transparency in small companies with positions that have several people in the same position versus one person in a position? For example, would you share the pay range for your sole CFO position with the entire company or just with the person in that role? Confidentiality versus transparency.
Oh, that's a great question, right? Of like, do you know your own pay range versus do you know the pay ranges of the whole organization? And then how do you think about executive pay? And does that differ from staff pay or whatever the language and terms are you're using? There's no right or wrong on that, right? I think you have to, but you do have to think about that question and answer it. Pay transparency doesn't mean everybody knows everybody's pay and knows every pay range. That doesn't have to be the answer to it. Maybe it's an aspiration on your journey. And then I think it depends on your industry. I know you mentioned company size in the question. I don't know if organization size matters as much about how much you share, but maybe do you have a construct to really, if you're having jobs that are maybe more blended or more hybrid because you have less people or you're a leaner organization, those are all things you'll want to think about in how you communicate that. What else might you add on the executive piece?
I would just think about all this like on the scale of evolution.
Yeah.
Right? Like the very basic sense, like pay transparency means you share your hiring range and then you can maybe go to the next step and you share the range for the salary that the person is in. But it's then working towards sharing the context. But I don't think what we're talking about is that everybody knows what everybody makes. I mean, I don't know that that's a good idea, but I think it's about helping people understand how the decisions are made about their own compensation. That is where we're trying to go, because if you think about where we're trying to go then, it's to having a high trust organization. And then moving everybody's like distracted thoughts around how they're paid to more important things like how could they develop? How could they add value? How could they contribute? And once we remove like all these questions around how we're paid from our day-to-day life, or how do we get to the next level so we could get more pay, like if people knew the answers to those questions, they could start to focus on the things that are really more important and impactful, both for the individual and for the company.
And I heard something about in that question that made me think, like, if you have hesitancy around this, like if sharing your CFO's pay range gives you pause, like try to unpack that. Like, why is that? What makes you uncomfortable about it? Is it because you've made exceptions? Is it because you're thinking about pay ratios? Like, try to really understand like what's holding you back from being transparent in those types of scenarios too. I saw some other questions we could take. I think we're trying to get a mic in the front of the room.
Okay, there we go. We have a company that has many clients here in California, and as they start being more transparent, one of the more interesting and challenging problems we've been seeing is it's related to tenure in position. So let's say somebody's been in the job for 5 years or better than 5 years. They're limited to a 3% merit budget typically. And in a fast-moving market, in an environment where jobs are rising at a higher rate than that, we have situations that we run across where somebody's behind market, new employees are hired, come in higher than the longer tenure employee. That's a sticky mess to try and unravel when we start communicating. How should we approach that, and what should we recommend as an approach to being transparent?
It's super messy, right? Like I said, it's not like you just started with a blank page and can say, we're going to start off with this value system and everybody fits perfectly. So these are scenarios we see. I think one thing, if you are valuing time in the position, is to consider a time and role construct, and then to figure out what's the budget and then how to course correct for that. And really, you could embed that to say our philosophy is we're targeting midpoint or more competitive pay when you've been here for 5 years. Like, test who doesn't fit there yet and what's the gap. And you might have to take a year or multiple years of correction to do that as well. But the standard 3% merit probably isn't going to help you get ready for pay transparency, right? So we didn't probably say this a lot today, but there are some budget implications to the readiness aspect as well if you're trying to move towards a new construct or be clear about something that might not have been the system in place before. So it's hard. It's definitely hard. None of this is easy. That's why we started off with saying, do the hard things. It takes more conversation. It takes more budget. It takes more clarity around these types of things. But you do have to have a stake in the ground. Like, you have to figure out what you value. And if it's market competitiveness over time and role, those people are in the role, you could do market adjustments, right? Those types of things.
But this is what we're talking about with, like, we have like hyper flexibility right now, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't been addressing this. Nobody really has, right? That's why if we didn't have all these challenges, everybody would just be transparent. It's not really a big deal. But the problem is we have that kind of situation happening, and lots of other ones too, that make it really difficult to be transparent because we can't answer those questions. We don't have budgets set up to address them. We don't have people trained. We don't have guidelines in place that would say, here's what we do in that situation. And so all that speaks to the readiness aspect of this. And it's why it does take a lot of work to get ready, and it's why we're encouraging everybody to start doing this now if you're not already, because eventually you will have to do it. It's just a matter of time. So it's, sorry, I want to give you like that magic bullet answer and be like, do it like this, but budget's the main problem.
Yeah.
So it's about aligning your stakeholders, like start with CFO and others. We have a question
There's
here.
a question up front here.
Okay.
Yeah, there, and then maybe up front.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am from public sector, and we lag considerably. So mine kind of piggybacks on his, is how to have the conversations with leadership about the readiness aspect. One of your slides talked about how it's going to, when you're more pay transparent, it's going to lead to exposing some of those exceptions and exposing the inequalities. And our leadership has not wanted to do it because of that, and we don't have the budget to address everybody. But I keep trying to push, there's got to be a starting point. So do you have any guidance on like what that starting point should look like with leadership, of saying, start at somebody that's, the longest serving people, your high performers at this percentage, or anything like that?
I think it's okay to say you're going to have a legacy program, right? Or that nobody's pay is going to change or decrease. Like, you could start with that kind of construct so that it's kind of out there. Like, we've made pay decisions in the past, and like we're keeping those intact, but here's what we're moving towards. Again, it's not easy if there's going to be, some known, widened gaps, right, in that sense. But I think part of that is like, again, figuring out like what your stakeholders are really giving them pause and how to help them have some of those conversations too.
And I find the numbers talk, like a pay equity study might tell you like, okay, you've got some issues and you've got to correct them, and then everyone's like, well, there's no budget, but the budget for dealing with litigation is much, much higher.
Yes.
So I think that having those conversations and, engaging, and just pulling that data together, and at some point there's going to be leadership that just never buys in, and oh well, but I think the dollars and the money can talk about, and you kind of compare the cost of not doing it. But yeah, those are tough ones too, because not everybody sort of just wants to do it. So.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Once you have your scale set,
Yeah.
what's the best method to equitably determine raises across your scale? Is it to set a cost of living adjustment across everyone?
I'm seeing, and I'm kind of liking more this concept of like an across-the-board adjustment. I tend not to like the word COLA because it implies like you're going to match inflation somehow, but that you have this across-the-board increase that you're either using it to keep up with expenses and costs and things like that, but it could just be market adjustment too, like you're going to give that, and then reserving a smaller budget if you are going to do merit-based pay. So if that's, instead of trying to spread 3.2% versus 3.4% for somebody, like everybody gets 2.5, and then some people get 5, right? Like you could do something like that. That tends to be one of my more favorite ones right now for one quick example. Yeah. We have to wrap it up. I think I saw wrap up. We're happy to take questions if people wanted to come up afterwards.
Great, thank
or
you
in the
very
hall,
much.
I think we're supposed to go.
Thank you, Nancy and Amanda. It's really great.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Please take
everybody.
the survey.